Have you ever noticed that when you go low carb, that you're actually more sensitive to carbohydrates than you were before, and it might take a little bit more insulin than it did before to bring your blood sugars back down or to handle any carbohydrates you might consume? Some might construe this as insulin resistance, which isn't true. It's actually something completely different. So we're going to go over insulin resistance and the phenomenon that results in less tolerance to glucose on a low carb diet. We're going to find out what's different about these two, and you'll be more the wiser for it. So what is insulin resistance? Insulin resistance means that your body is resistant to insulin. In the case of type 2 diabetes, and this is actually a big deal because insulin resistance is strongly linked to every sort of fatal disease under the sun: heart disease, cancer, stroke, just obesity in general, and so many other issues, PCOS, just millions of different things are linked to insulin resistance. You want to not be insulin resistant as much as possible. And of course, the most likely thing it'll lead to is type 2 diabetes, which is the end result of being so insulin resistant that your body cannot keep up with it anymore. Insulin resistance is when your body eats food, sugar is made from that, you use insulin to put that sugar into your cells and make it work. You become resistant when you're eating so much sugar and using so much insulin that your body is less sensitive before. And to compensate, your body will make more and more insulin. And this will create a vicious cycle where you're making more insulin for that sugar and more insulin until it just can't keep up anymore. And that is when you end up with type 2 diabetes. Of course, you don't want that, right? Because again, that is linked to all sorts of issues. You want to avoid that as best you can. So when you find that you need to start bolusing more for carbs on a low carb approach, you need to actually start bolusing for protein. You might think that is insulin resistance, and that is a big problem. But don't worry, they aren't the same thing at all. That insulin resistance I was talking about, the one that leads to all the complications, the bad insulin resistance, is called pathological insulin resistance. It happens over time. It takes, decades and decades for it to fully accumulate and cause the severe issues that it causes. While what happens on a low-carb diet happens very fast and is known as physiological insulin resistance. What's happening here isn't that your body is making tons and tons of insulin and your cells are just more and more resistant to it, like with type 2 diabetes. Instead, what's happening is that your body is actually using a lot less insulin now. It is using a lot less carbs for fuel, and in response, your body starts to become more fat adapted. Your muscle cells start using fat for fuel instead of sugar, and same for a lot of other cells in your body. There are still some cells that do need sugar, like your brain and your red blood cells, but most of the rest can run on fat. And when you're on a very low carb approach long enough, those cells, the ones that can run on fat, are going to reject glucose because they can use the fat, and they want to save what little glucose there is for the brain, for the red blood cells, and for the other cells that need sugar. So really, it isn't that your body is more resistant to insulin. In fact, in most cases, what people find is that they lose weight and actually become more sensitive to insulin. For example, in my case, I've noticed that I take much, much, much less basal than I used to, and I actually inject much, much less insulin on a daily basis. I'm actually more insulin sensitive than I was before, but less tolerant to sugar, to carbs. It'll make me spike much more than it did before. But I'm still some more sensitive to insulin. It all ties back into our body being more used to fat now than it is to sugar. Consider it like a factory, right? If you have a factory and it's all running on gas-powered machines, and one day it decides to go electric, starts converting all the machines to electric and so on, all the machines not running electric now. If you suddenly just dump a whole bunch of gasoline in that factory, it's not going to be able to use it immediately like it would have back when it was running just on gas. Same thing with fat and sugar. If you go on a low carb approach, your body's going to be more used to fat. The enzymes, the various molecules and cells are going to be used to running fat, and when you suddenly bring a bunch of sugar back in, once again, it's not going to be so used to that anymore because it hasn't had that much for a long time and it's gotten used and it's started making the mechanizations for using an alternative fuel source. It's going to take a little bit longer to deal with that than it would have if it was already used to running on sugar, like it would have been before you went low carb. So just keep that in mind. The physiological insulin resistance you get on low carb is not the same thing as the pathological insulin resistance you get that leads to diabetes and all the host of other issues. Again, keep in mind, you are using more insulin to cover for protein. You might need more insulin to figure out a correction or for any carbs you're eating. But that said, you're still using much less insulin throughout the day. In almost all the interviews I've done, and almost all the stories I've seen, yes, people need more insulin for protein, but they aren't using insulin for all the carbs anymore. So their boluses actually go way down. Their basal also usually goes way down. They're losing weight. And in the end, while they are using more insulin for that protein, they're using much less insulin in total. And when you're using less insulin total, that means less chance of hyperinsulinemia, aka insulin resistance, and better chance for living a healthy life. So just keep that in mind. Don't worry so much about this sort of resistance, this sort of intolerance that you might be experiencing. It's completely natural, it's completely fine. And as long as you stay away from the carbs and don't have a sudden cheat day, don't go back and forth between low carb and high carb, and you're going to be doing amazing. Keep that in mind as you tame your type 1 and try your best not to cheat. Because whatever diet you're on, you want to stick to it. Especially with keto, especially with low carb, especially with carnivore, or any other very low carb diet. Just stick to it. You'll be fine. You don't have to worry about it at all.